I'd like to extend my welcome to all our viewers out there. I'm Jason Dawsey from the National World War II Museum's Institute for the Study of War and Democracy. And it's to my great pleasure today to bring in my friend, Dr. Emma Kuby from Northern Illinois University for a discussion about survival and witnessing. Dr. Kuby is Associate Professor and Assistant Department Chair in the Department of History at Northern Illinois University. She received her PhD at Cornell in 2011 and worked with Dominic LeCapper, really one of the great intellectual historians of his generation. She has an extensive list of publications, really too long for me to read out here, a whole series of articles that especially have dealt with the war in Algeria. France's war in Algeria in 1954 to 62, and especially the role that intellectuals played in the discussions about this war. But for our purposes today, she's here to talk about her 2019 book, Political Survivors, the Resistance, the Cold War, and the Fight Against Concentration Camps After 1945. Now, for our viewers out there, this book has already gotten quite a bit of attention, so I just will note two awards the book has already received. The 2020 European Studies Book Award from the Council of European Studies and the Pinckney Prize from the Society for French Historical Studies. So, Dr. Kuby, we are delighted to have you here with us today. Welcome. I thought I would just start out by letting our viewers know that you and I met in 2009. Yep. It's really unbelievable, right? That it's been that long ago, back in 2009 at a conference organized by the Peace History Society at Winthrop University. And we were both dealing with issues about violence, responses to violence, internationalism. Obviously, a lot of time has passed since then, Emma, but we've stayed in touch, and we're so glad to have you here and really looking forward to talking with you about this book, Political Survivors. So I thought what I would do just to get us started is that every book, of course, has its own story, its own background. Projects really do evolve and develop. And could you tell us a bit about how you got interested in this particular project about French concentration camp survivors and how this project has evolved into its present form?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Jason. And thanks so much for that generous introduction. Thanks to the museum for hosting me today. I'm really delighted to be here with you. So this project, I'm a French intellectual and political historian. I came at this work initially through my interest in French intellectual debates over state violence in the 1940s and 1950s, so kind of at the height of the Cold War. And I started working on this my second year of graduate school. I was in a Soviet history research seminar and didn't read Russian. The professor of that seminar, Peter Holquist, let me write a paper instead on French intellectual responses to Soviet violence. And I noticed in the course of doing that work that concentration camp survivors, French concentration camp survivors, were intervening in those debates in ways that no one had really singled out as specific to survivors as such. And so through my research at that point and later in graduate school, I learned that there existed an activist organization of Nazi camp survivors that had actually pursued this kind of work for a decade throughout the 50s, investigating, condemning, crusading against inhumane detention systems around the world. This was originally just one chapter in my dissertation. I had a kind of broader framework about political violence and intellectuals in post-war France, but it kept nagging at me. It was such an incredible story, and I eventually realized, kind of to my dismay, because it's not a great idea to write a first book that is substantially different from the dissertation, but I eventually realized that this had to be a book, that I had to kind of tell the history of this organization. So that was the genesis of this project.
It is an incredible story. And so, I mean, it's easy for someone else to say, you made a great decision on this one, but it is really a remarkable story. And I think we'll be able to get into a lot of that story in our discussion today. I'd like to begin with a quotation in terms of talking to our readers, guiding our readers into what are the key arguments, the key points of emphasis in your book. A really striking set of numbers you give in the first chapter. You point out in the case of France that more than 48% of those deported to the Nazi camp system for resistance activity returned, more than 48%. Of those deported as Jews, considered racial deportees, only 3% returned. So this will be play a major role in your book about how we understand survival and how we understand witnessing. I think for many of us, we think we understand those concepts. They seem so familiar to us, and yet your book really does complicate that story a lot, right? About that these are not self-evident concepts. What does it mean to be a survivor? What does it mean to witness about one's experience in the Nazi camps? So with that, I mean, why don't we talk about a few of these returnees, these survivors who came back? And I thought that maybe two of them, there's several of them, and each of them had such an interesting, rich history, but two in particular that you really focus on are David Rousset and Germaine Tillion. So could you tell us a bit about these individuals up to their return in France in 1945?
Yeah, sure. This is the fun part for me. Before I talk about those individuals, I should probably stress and kind of be clear from the outset, not for you who's familiar with this from the book, but for other people listening in, is that my work is about survivors, but it is not about Jewish survivors, by and large. The book's title is Political Survivors, and it refers to a distinction that really mattered to people in the 1940s and the 1950s in Western Europe, and particularly in a place like France. This was a distinction between racial survivors, people who had been deported because of, in France, the case of their Jewish racial identity, and people who have been deported because of their political activity, their anti-Nazi activity, their involvement in the resistance. There are a lot of categories here, and the numbers are contested, but Jason's absolutely right in saying that a much higher proportion of people who were deported for political reasons returned to France after the war. And because of that differential survival rate, and because of some other things you mentioned, when people spoke about concentration camp survivors in post-war France, they predominantly were referring to, they imagined the kind of paradigmatic case of a concentration camp survivor was someone who had been deported for their resistance activity. I have an image that might help listeners just kind of take this in, that when people talked about concentration camp survivors, they were not really thinking about Jews in post-war France. We could maybe share that image. It is a set of images I put together from different museums and memorials throughout France, memorials to the resistance and the deportation. And even if you don't read French, you can see throughout these, and they're from different cities in France, the fronts of museums, the insides of displays, plaques. You can see those two words linked together. If you were going to make a museum commemorating the deportation, people being sent out of France to the concentration camps, that was linked to the resistance. People knew that Jews had died in the camps as well. They were kind of aware of this, but the word Holocaust didn't exist yet to delineate that as a separate experience. The word genocide had just been coined. It was barely being used. And so when people talked about survivors, when people talked about the deportation, when people talked about witnessing, they generally imagined that the person taking on that role was someone who had engaged in heroic resistance activity and then had returned to France after that, and was now speaking as a witness, coming kind of out of both of those experiences. What that means, I'll just say one more thing and then I'll talk about the people that Jason asked me about. What that means is that when they bore witness, Jewish survivors were of course bearing witness as well. They were writing testimonies in this period, they were speaking out, but these more prominent voices of witness that were getting more public attention in France in the late 40s and early 50s when they spoke about their experience of deportation, they talked about concentration camps that were not extermination centers because they had not been deported to extermination centers like Treblinka, like Birkenau. They were non-Jews, and so they had been deported to concentration camps, places like Buchenwald and Dachau. Okay, so with all that said, let me tell you a little bit about some of the particular resistance deportees at the heart of the book. The first one is a man named David Rousset. I have some images of him and his books. You can see him up top there. He's with Sartre. And the bottom, the far corner, he is, this is a picture from the Holocaust Museum of his liberation from the camps. And there's a couple of his books over on the screen. He's the most important figure in my book. Before the war, he was a Trotskyist militant. He was a journalist, he was a writer. He wasn't particularly famous. He was just very busy on the French far left scene. He was arrested for his resistance activities during the course of the war, and he was deported to a whole set of camps and subcamps, including Buchenwald and Neuengamme. He survived, and he returned to France. He was emaciated, his teeth were ruined, he was suffering from typhus, but he immediately started writing, dictating actually, to his wife, testimony about the interior world of the Nazi camps. And his two books here are these kind of searing sociological descriptions of life in the camps, intended as what he voiced as a warning to what he believed was a replicable experiment in how man could be inhumane to man. These were really the two most important books of post-war testimony to the Nazi camps that were published in France. They won prizes. Rousset was identified as France's witness among witnesses to the Nazi camps. And he started moving in much higher flying company than he had before the war. Hence the picture of him here with Sartre. They founded a political party together in the late 1940s. So he really came to stand in as a kind of figurehead for the whole resistance deportation. Germaine Tillion is a really different case, although she and Rousset were friends and comrades. She was an anthropologist before the war, an ethnographer. She worked in very mountainous, remote regions of France's Algerian colony, and she was an academic. She was a very early star when the war broke out with Germany, when France was occupied. And she was arrested in 1942, along with her mother. They were both deported in 1943 to Ravensbrück, the women's camp of the Nazi concentration camp system. There are whole books written about her experience in the camp. She was extraordinarily tenacious. She wrote a five-act comic operetta in Ravensbrück. And she also took secret notes during her time there. She saw herself as a witness, as a kind of anthropological witness from the very start. She imagined herself as an ethnographer of the camp and began collecting evidence. She survived, although her mother did not. And despite her devastation, she set to work again, bearing witness almost immediately upon her return to France, writing about the camp, sitting in on war trials of the Ravensbrück guards, and so on. So I know this has been kind of a long answer. I'll just say that kind of what sets Rousset and Tillion together, really, some things that they have in common as witnesses, is that they were both justice-seeking and kind of present-oriented. They imagined their work of bearing witness. They didn't really talk about, oh, we want to just memorialize what happened. They talked about the work of bearing witness to the camps as an activity that you pursued in the world because you wanted to build a more just world after World War II. And the other thing to probably say is that both of them, when they talked about what the Nazi camps were like, were most focused on the experience of resistance deportees, not Jews, not other racial victims of the Nazi state.
Well, that's really interesting, Emma, about the continuities and discontinuities and their kind of political and intellectual activities from prior to World War II through the resistance and then what kind of intellectuals they really then become in post-1945 France. And I think we'll be able to get into that a bit more, especially here with this next question, which gets into some of the big ideas that we associate with, especially with Rousset, but also Tillion and others that coalesce around them. And so I thought we would bring in a couple of these. And I'm just quoting you here from the book again, that the post-war writings of many of these intellectuals, quote, certainly helped solidify a concentrationary rather than an exterminationist paradigm for understanding the criminality of the Nazis. So with this in mind, Emma, I wanted to ask you about two of these kind of difficult concepts. So we can, I think, just get them on the table for our viewers right away, which is the concentrationary universe. It's such a striking phrase. The concentrationary universe and concentrationary evil.
Thanks, Jason. And I should say that the distinction that you quote there between exterminationist and concentrationary understandings of Nazi evil it's not mine. It's historian Sam Moyne's. And Moyne kind of makes this argument that, look, when we think about the Nazi state's crimes, we have a kind of synecdoche in mind, like one thing that sort of stands in for us for the evil of this state. And he says, for a long time, throughout the 1950s into the 1960s, our idea of the key evil of the Nazi state was the concentration camp. This has now, according to Moyne, been replaced with an exterminationist paradigm in which when we think about the key evil of the Nazi state, we think about the Holocaust, about the mass murder of 6 million Jews, as well as other targeted groups by the Nazi state. So this is Moyne's distinction, but the word concentrationary is actually David Rousset's. He coined it in the immediate post-war moment. You might have noticed it on the cover of one of his books on that slide that I had. The idea here is that Nazism's greatest crime, it's kind of singular, what they call its crime majeur, was not killing people. Again, remember, genocide is barely a word in use at this point, but forcing them to live in situations of absolutely extreme, inhuman degradation and abasement. So Rousset argues that all of the camps were essentially similar in creating these sorts of conditions for detainees. What that means is that his concept of Nazi evil, of concentrationary evil, is centered on the experience of resistance deportees, again, as opposed to Jewish or Roma or what have you, deportees. This is the concentration camp conceived as a punishment for political belief and action. The degradation of man as someone who joins the resistance, tries to stand up for his beliefs, and is then punished in this way. And this idea so the idea then is that this is a particular kind of evil, and for Rousset, it's very black and white. Rousset is not someone who uses the language of human rights. He's not interested really in rights talk. He doesn't talk about whether states have violated this or that right. He has a really very black and white view of what survivors' moral calling is. It's to oppose concentrationary forms of human suffering. And everything else, there's no continuum. There's no shades of gray here. Other kinds of prisons, other kinds of detention centers might not be great, but if they don't count as concentration camps, they're not an object of his moral concern. So what that means is that when he and other survivors start to organize in the post-war moment against current injustices, they see concentrationary evil as totally distinct from plain old injustice. They insist that survivors have a kind of duty and a calling to respond only to that. They say we can't get distracted responding to this or that human rights abuse, right? This is the one thing that we are called to speak out against.
No, that's fascinating. And that takes me then to the next kind of logical step is them organizing. I mean, Rousset, Tillion, there's many others that we could bring in here. You might decide to bring in, but they do kind of come together in this organization, the CICRC, the International Commission Against the Concentration Camp Regime. And this organization, obviously, you do a lot with it in the book. I mean, you spend a lot of time looking at this organization and its history from really the late 40s, really for a decade till the end of the 1950s. Could you tell us about this organization, how it came about, and at least at the start, like how did it come about and what were its aims? What did it set out to do?
Yeah. So yes, this organization is at the heart of my book. And for people trying to match the acronym to the name, it's an acronym of the French name of the organization. So the International Commission Against the Concentration Camp Regime is a consequence of a front page newspaper appeal that David Rousset publishes in late 1949. He addresses it to fellow survivors throughout Western Europe. This is a moment of intense Cold War tension. At this point, Rousset has broken with the Trotskyists. The party he tried to found with Sartre, a kind of revolutionary leftist new political party, has failed. He's very bitter about the hold of French communists over French political life. And he is also, he's come to believe genuinely, and not as a kind of propaganda position, that the Soviet Gulag, the system of penal labor camps throughout the USSR territories, is a concentration camp system. And so in late 1949, Rousset issues this appeal calling on Nazi camp survivors to come together and investigate the Soviet Gulag. It's important to make a distinction here. Rousset doesn't say survivors should, really support the UN doing an investigation. Survivors should be in favor of an investigation. Rousset says Nazi camp survivors need to carry out this investigation, that by virtue of their experience in the Nazi camps, they're the only people who are equipped to issue this kind of moral judgment of whether concentrationary evil is again at work on the face of the earth. And so he calls on survivors. He says they have a duty to bear witness to this suffering that is parallel and in his view really identical to their own past suffering. The appeal has a lot of consequences. I talk about them in the book. It's a really explosive document in Cold War Europe. But ultimately, the most important consequence for me is that survivors from throughout Western Europe do indeed coalesce into an organization under David Rousset's leadership throughout the course of 1950 to investigate camp systems and determine whether they're concentrationary. They make one crucial change, though, from Rousset's initial appeal. They insist that the Soviet Union cannot be the only target, that if they're going to come together in this organization, they're going to investigate concentration camps worldwide without regard for the political system of the country that has them. And so ultimately, they wind up carrying out investigations of both the USSR as well as French Tunisia, Greece, Spain under Francisco Franco, China, and French Algeria, and smaller interventions elsewhere. So that's one way in which this group is international, right? They're articulating a global obligation to care about what states do to their own citizens in peacetime, in a pre-human rights era, really. And so this is a very big deal. The organization is also international in its membership. It retains French leadership. Tillion is a very important figure in it throughout. But it brings in people from 7 different European countries. And it's also diverse in other ways. I have actually some pictures here that might give you a sense of the nature of the membership. These are just some pictures from actions and then some other shots of members. You can see they have other kinds of professional lives. Alfred Serge Balikowski, who's there at the bottom, is a world-renowned entomologist and Buchenwald survivor who's involved, for example. So the group is diverse in all kinds of ways. There are men, there are women, women in important leadership roles in the group. There are conservatives, there are Gaullists, there are socialists, there are other varieties of non-communist leftists. There are Catholics, there are atheists, there are Protestants. But going back to kind of the initial thing we talked about, Jason, there's one way in which the group is not diverse. And this is that it only permits political survivors of the Nazi camps to join. Those who were deported because of what the Nazi state labeled their racial identity are not allowed to become members of the CICRC. This is written into its bylaws. You have to have been deported for anti-Nazi, selfless or patriotic activity. This doesn't mean that Jews are not allowed. Jews who were deported as a result of their resistance activity are welcome. But Jews who were deported because they were Jews are not welcome to join the group.
That's such a startling thing, I think, for
Yes.
a reader of your book to come across, is how that definition of who counts as a resistor and then who counts then is really eligible for membership in the CICRC. It's really unsettling how they frame this, and obviously your book kind of charts how this framework itself will run into all kinds of problems as they look at these particular cases of whether or not a concentrationary system is in place or not. And I think we'll be able to get into some of that in some of the later questions. But one of the things I think that really startles the reader too, Emma, is some of the unexpected support that the CICRC receives. And in this case, I think definitely the greatest surprise in here is the role of the American CIA. Could you tell us about how the CIA actually gets involved in the story?
I can, yes. And you're you're absolutely right. This is one of the really unsettling aspects of this history, in addition to the exclusion of Jewish survivors. And I should say that the exclusion of Jewish survivors is startling to us. It was uncontroversial at the time. This was a common kind of admissions policy for all kinds of survivor organizations that drew these hierarchies and distinctions. So this kind of fit in with the 1950s worldview of thinking about the camps. Taking CIA support would have been controversial even in the moment that it happened. And so this is a kind of secret thing. When I started working on the CICRC, I imagine, I'm an intellectual historian. I thought I'm working on themes of witnessing and memory and, these intellectual responses to violence. In the course of my research for the project, I stumbled across the fact that the CICRC had been funded by American intelligence agencies. And all of a sudden, it turns out I have to think about very different kinds of history, do very different kinds of history, tracking the money, going to American archives, trying to kind of trace these networks of collusion and clandestine support. So it really changed the nature of the project for me. It was not what I set out to do. I should say we don't know all the details here. The CIA files that are related to support for foreign-based organizations in this period remain entirely closed. One thing got kind of accidentally declassified, so I do have a document listing the CICRC as an organization supported by the CIA, from the CIA. Almost everything else I have, and this is true for most historians who work on the CIA in the Cold War period, almost everything else I have comes from the side of the CICRC, and I have to kind of work backwards from those documents to trace where the money came from. What's clear is that the CICRC's activities were funded by the US government for a number of years, with heavy involvement of liaisons in the US labor movement who mobilized against what they called forced labor in the USSR and the Eastern Bloc states during the Cold War. The Americans were ecstatic that Rousset had found this language for condemning the Soviet Union, condemning Stalin, that seemed to resonate so strongly in Western Europe, where communism's appeal remained high, where communists continued to kind of claim the mantle of the resistance in which they had been very active. And so Rousset kind of reverses that equation and mobilizes the resistance identity against communists. The CIA liked his leftist credentials. They weren't bothered by that. And they liked the resistance prestige of the whole organization. They believed that even though it had reoriented itself towards a global mission, that it was fundamentally oriented against communist states, that its members were anti-communist, and that its propaganda value was actually only increased by the fact that it looked fair-minded and objective and was, also targeting states like right-wing dictatorship in Spain, for example. And so through a variety of funding mechanisms, they funded its work, along with the work of many other anti-communist initiatives in Western Europe in this period, for about 7 years. I think it's important to underline that most survivor members of the CICRC were oblivious to this. Rousset was not. Rousset understood where the money was coming from, and a few other people did as well. Most members did not. Tillion did not. She had nothing to do with the funding side of things. Most members of the CICRC truly believed that they were kind of standing up to state violence in the name of individual conscience, not in the name of another state's government. And so it's a complicated history.
No, it's an extremely complicated history. And I think for our viewers out there, when you get a copy of Emma's book, it will be quite a journey for you to read about the CIA's involvement in this project and what that carries with it. But speaking of the Soviet Union and the CICRC's position on that, you look at a couple of cases where the CICRC, you've already mentioned this, in fact, where they try to determine whether or not there's a concentrationary system in place. And I thought we could talk about two of those, Emma. Obviously, the Soviet Union, the Gulag system, is one that I think everyone is at least familiar with. And the CICRC is very visible in this case. And then the other is, toward the end of your book, is French Algeria, the French colony of Algeria. And very different cases, and each one explosive politically. So we thought we'd kind of, for our viewers, you could take us through how each of these cases played out.
Absolutely, yeah. Those are good choices. So the USSR, I'll talk about the Soviet case first, and then I'll kind of fast forward to the Algerian case. The Soviet Union was Rousset's original target, and in many ways it was the group's most spectacular investigation, and its first. The goal of Rousset and the other survivors that he worked with was always to engage in eyewitnessing of camps. But in this case, that wasn't possible. The Soviet Union was not going to grant these anti-communist Nazi camp survivors access to come over and go on a grand tour of the Gulag. And so they had to come up with an alternative model of witnessing. And probably not surprisingly in this context, about 5 years after the Nuremberg war trial for Nazi war criminals, they held a mock crimes against humanity trial in Brussels in 1951, putting the Soviet Union in the dock for the crime against humanity of possessing concentration camps. This was an elaborate kind of media spectacle, deliberate restaging of Nuremberg. But it was imagined very differently than Nuremberg in a couple of ways that I think are interesting. The Nuremberg trials were, historians refer to them as, and lawyers involved at the time referred to them as trial by document. They included deliberately very, very little victim witness testimony. They tried to convict Nazi war criminals on the basis of irrefutable written evidence. Here, the idea was very different. It was Nuremberg kind of reimagined as a celebration of witnessing and of victim witnesses, of survivors as voices of human conscience. So the whole courtroom was staffed by Nazi camp survivors. David Rousset was the prosecutor. Germaine Tillion was one of the judges. All of the roles, bailiff, stenographer, everybody was a Nazi camp survivor. And then the whole proceeding was organized around the testimony of Gulag survivors who came before their, in the mind of the court, their brethren from the Concentrationary Universe and spoke about their experience. And Rousset was very explicit during the trial that this was about the world community's duty to listen to survivors' voices. It was an extremely dramatic event. It got tons of press coverage. The verdict at the end was entirely unsurprising. It was a propaganda event. They found the USSR guilty of crimes against humanity. So the verdict was kind of a Cold War, it was a foregone conclusion in Cold War circumstances. But what was significant here, I think, is the ways in which the trial ended up shaping real international justice. It did two really important things. First, it actually helped settle that crimes against humanity could be carried out by states against their own citizens in peacetime. This was not settled at Nuremberg. Crimes against humanity there had to be tied to war crimes. And Nazi concentration camps pre-1939 were explicitly discussed as a crime that was not justiciable by the Nuremberg judges because no war was happening yet. So the CICRC helped move that definition of crimes against humanity away from the linkage to war crimes and to make it clearer that this was something the world community could care about outside of a context of international war. The second thing that the mock trial did, and this has kind of come through, I think, in what I've already said, is that it helped reorient ideas about the purpose of international justice around the idea of bearing witness to survivors' voices. That when we talk about justice, part of what we mean is listening to the voices of people who have been victims of state violence. So that was the Soviet case. Should I go ahead and talk about Algeria,
Sure.
Jason?
Sure.
Okay, I'll press fast forward. The USSR was the CICRC's first investigation, and French Algeria would turn out to be its last. This was a very different kind of investigation because France permitted on-the-ground access for the CICRC. So they were allowed to visit prison sites, they were allowed to visit detention camps, and this turned it into a very different kind of affair. What's going on in Algeria, this is 1957. So France is at war in its Algerian colony against Algerian nationalists, the National Liberation Front. And this is a war that's begun in 1954. It's an undeclared war. So France can't have POW camps. So it has been using political detention and emergency powers rather than the laws of war to sideline opponents out of the conflict. France has also been committing war crimes and atrocities. This is the height of the Battle of Algiers when the CICRC shows up on the scene. And if you know anything about the Battle of Algiers, you probably have a vague sense in your mind of torture. And this is the best known of the kind of war crimes that France committed in the course of the Algerian War. So David Rousset, who is certainly an anti-communist, but is also a very committed anti-imperialist, he moves mountains to get the CICRC access. And incredibly, again, kind of drawing on this moral prestige of the resistance and the resistance deportation, he succeeds. So the CICRC carries out this historic, very thorough investigation of French Algerian camps during the height of the Battle of Algiers. They send a Belgian, a Dutch, and a Norwegian investigator, along with 2 French observers, and one of those is Tillion, who, as you might imagine, is entirely caught up in and passionate about the tragedy that's unfolding in Algeria at this point. All of her ethnographic work has been in Algeria. She has deep ties to the Algerian community, and so she's kind of a part of this mission. What ends up happening is they carry out this investigation. They're really troubled by what they see in Algeria, but at the same time, as they visit camps there, French political detention camps for Algerian nationalists, those camps don't strike them as being the same as Buchenwald, the same as Ravensbrück, the same as Dachau. And so they issue their results, which are highly critical of France, which talk about torture, talk about disappearances, talk about illegalities and detention methods. But they also say, no, these aren't concentration camps. And remember, within this black and white worldview in which they work, that's a not guilty verdict. They're saying, we are here to see whether France has concentration camps, and the answer is no, they don't. So the ultimate result of all of this is, in fact, the collapse of the organization. And that's true for a lot of reasons, and we can kind of talk some more about it, but I'll say kind of 3 things that Algeria ends up doing to the CICRC. One is that it loses its CIA funding as a result of this inquiry. Again, we don't have the documents to know exactly why, but from the commission's own side, it looks as if the Americans are really unhappy with this devotion of resources to investigating a non-communist ally state. They think this is a big embarrassment, and so they pull back funds. The second reason that the investigation destroys the CICRC is that members are all survivors, but they don't all have the same politics. And a lot of French members are in support of continued French control of Algeria. They're pro-colonialists. When they joined the French resistance as French patriots, they imagined an imperial France that included Algeria. And so once it becomes clear to them that Rousset intends to target France in the same way that he targeted the USSR, they quit. The third reason, I think the most interesting reason that the investigation destroys the organization is that because it forces members to declare, to give France a not guilty verdict, anti-colonialists who are in the group and figures who care a lot about Algeria, like Tillion, they quit too. They say, this actually wasn't a very useful exercise to go and see if France is rebuilding Buchenwald in Algerian territory. France isn't, but who cares? That doesn't mean that therefore what France is doing is great. That doesn't mean that we're addressing the real ethical emergency that is happening in Algeria. And so they kind of see that the CICRC's whole mission, which seemed to make sense in the post-war moment, now no longer really matches up with the demands of responding to state violence in the era of decolonization. And so the organization winds down by the end of the 1950s.
No, it's amazing the way that the Algerian conflict, it's such a tumultuous time within France about how to respond to that conflict. And you point out, Emma, how the organization really just can't hold together either. I mean, there are a lot of obviously 1958, what happens with de Gaulle there, we could even get into that if we had more time, but it's an incredible story really about this decade that starts out where they're so visible, opposing what they see as Soviet totalitarianism, and then the case about the home country and colonialism, how that really does tear it apart. If you could briefly, Emma, and then we're going to open things up for some questions. Could you say something for our audience, though, about the post-CICRC careers of Rousset and Tillion?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Both of them lived for a long time after the CICRC ended. David Rousset didn't die until 1997. Germaine Tillion lived to be 100 years old. She died in 2008. Rousset wore a lot of hats. Both of them, once the CICRC ceased operating, were kind of freed to intervene in much more political and frank terms around the Algerian conflict. Rousset was a proponent of Algerian independence, and he kind of fought for that as a journalist. Tillion intervened in all kinds of ways against the various forms of violence unfolding in Algeria. After that war ended, Rousset wore all kinds of different hats. He was a journalist, he was a writer, he briefly was in the National Assembly. But he didn't have the same cultural capital as time went on. And that's not because of anything that he did. It's because of, well, for two reasons. One is that the prestige of the resistance began to carry kind of less weight in France as time moved forward and as de Gaulle was able to embody that resistance legacy himself. And the other reason is that movement that we talked about earlier, from a concentrationary to an exterminationist paradigm for understanding the crimes of the Nazi state. Rousset had invented a way of thinking about what the chief evil of World War II had been. And eventually, people didn't think about the chief evil of World War II in those terms anymore. And so he kind of slipped from relevance, although he's been resurrected in various ways in more recent years. Tillion had a long, very distinguished career in her professional life as an ethnographer. She retained a role as a very celebrated witness throughout her life. I have and beyond, I should say, I have an image here. Maybe we can kind of put up as we end your questions. She was actually reburied in the Pantheon in 2015. You can see her poster hanging there along with other resistance heroes. The Pantheon is France's secular shrine to its great national heroes. And so Tillion ended up there in 2015 with France's president at the time, François Hollande, eulogizing her both as a resistance heroine, but also as a great witness for David Rousset's International Commission against the concentration camp regime. So as this kind of example of moral courage. Of course, doing this eulogy without being aware of more complicated details of the CICRC's history, without knowing about its exclusion of Holocaust survivors, without knowing about its CIA funding. And so I think it's a kind of interesting footnote about the ways that history and myth work together in these later incarnations of our imagining of what a witness is after World War II. So yeah.
Thank you for that, Emma. I think we'll take some questions. We've gotten quite a few in already. I think one maybe you could just answer very briefly, Emma, is that there was a question about really where can we point out, it's neither Hitler nor Stalin that invents the concentration camp, but where can we say we see the first identifiable concentration camps at?
Yeah, okay, so this is a great question. And for anyone who's kind of interested in the real life history of concentration camps and not just kind of the intellectual history of ideas about them that I do, I'd really recommend Andrea Pitzker's book, One Long Night. It's a great, really accessible book that kind of covers this and goes up into the present. Historians who work on this kind of point to the late 1800s, the 1890s as a kind of inflection point moment. They point to camps in South Africa that were used during the Boer War, as well as US camps in this moment. People look at Cuba and the Philippines as places where what we can kind of identify as concentration camps, and in some cases, what government leaders called concentration camps existed. But the question gets complicated by the issue of how you define a concentration camp, which was a huge challenge even for members of the CICRC who had lived through what everyone agreed was a concentration camp. And so it gets tricky, but those are kind of the general things that historians point to.
Yeah, it's interesting, a very long history there. This next question comes from Henry, and he was curious about, given the French communists' role in the resistance and the way they often tried to monopolize the history of the resistance, how did they respond to the criticisms made by Rousset and others in the CICRC of communism in the Soviet Union?
Oh my goodness. So a big part of the kind of story that the book tells is about this conflict between Rousset and anti-communists and the French Communist Party. They respond in a couple of ways, but the chief kind of intellectual response is accusing Rousset of having invented this account of the Soviet camps wholesale by transposing things that were written by Nazi camp survivors. A guy named Pierre Dex, a French Communist Party member, kind of takes the lead in this attack, and Rousset then charges Dex with libel. And so there's a big trial that takes place in post-war Paris with the communists mobilized on one side and Rousset's whole team with American money behind them mobilized on the other side. And the communists make a huge propaganda push around this. They are not willing to give up this kind of mantle of the resistance or to countenance this what they see as a slander of the Soviet Union. And you see communist survivors dressing in concentration camp stripes and handing out anti-Rousset literature at subway entrances in Paris. There's all kinds of cartoons, just vicious attacks on him. Yeah, a long-term kind of mobilization. Other stuff happens on an organizational level. The communists lose control there's a schism in one of the major survivor organizations in the country that the communists had previously controlled. But I mean, essentially, it's a full frontal response, and it continues through the life of the organization.
Interesting. This next question is from Benson, and this is really tailored to us intellectual historians, Emma. This was a question about the CICRC's definition of the concentrationary regime, about the kind of influence that had over other intellectuals. And he raised George Orwell and Hannah Arendt and kind of totalitarianism theory about the influence that this category had.
Yeah, okay, so Rousset was a major influence for Arendt, not so much in his work in the CICRC as in his initial post-war testimony about the Nazi camps. So a quote from one of his books is, you know, at the head of her initial the concentration camps article that would be the basis of the origins of totalitarianism. She really relies on Rousset's kind of understanding of what a concentration camp was and what it did. But Rousset wasn't interested in totalitarianism. And that might be surprising. You know, we think of anti-communists in this period, especially anti-communists who want to talk about Nazis and Soviets together, using an anti-totalitarian language and saying left and right, it's all the same, it's totalitarian. Rousset, I can only think of a couple occasions in his life that he used the word totalitarian. He's simply not interested in that kind of vocabulary for comparing these regimes because he only wants to talk about the camp systems. He only wants to talk about the particular variety of suffering that he thinks concentration camps produce. And so he has this concentrationary language, and he really sets aside all other questions about the organization and bureaucracy of a totalitarian state. That's just not something that is one of the stakes for him. And it's one of the reasons, in addition to those I mentioned earlier, that he kind of drops out of the conversation in France in the 1970s as different kinds of languages of anti-totalitarianism start kind of dominating the anti-communist lefts and rights response to the Soviet Union.
So I think our final question, Emma, is a very light one here, which is about that your book kind of ends around 1959, 1960, the CICRC's end, and that the exterminationist paradigm that you pointed to, citing Samuel Moyn, I think a lot of people would point to the Eichmann trial, which starts the following year, right, in 1960. And then in West Germany, there's this very visible trial of people involved in Auschwitz-Birkenau. In the French case, when could you point to the beginnings of the exterminationist paradigm really beginning to take hold there?
Oh gosh, this is a nice easy one to end with. This is a really a huge object of debate among historians of the French case in particular. For a long time, people have pointed to the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem at the start of the 60s as an inflection point in this history. More recently, other scholars like Michael Rothberg have suggested that the Algerian War actually catalyzed some of these more racialized understandings of how state violence chooses its victims. Still, other scholars point to kind of other developments in French cultural life, a play called The Vicar that was really important in kind of understanding the Catholic Church's implications in the Holocaust. There's all kinds of publications, that people point to and say, this was the turning point. And, I mean, I have to punt here. I don't think that there was a turning point. I think this was a process that took place by fits and starts really throughout the entire post-war period. Things had shifted by the mid-1960s. But I'm not sure that we can identify a moment that they shifted. And they shifted a whole lot more after that. And it was really in the 1970s that the Holocaust became the framework in France for talking about the deportation. The other thing that I'll say in response to this is that I don't write about Jewish survivors, but I think that one of the things that my book tries to do is also to to point out, to emphasize that awareness of the Jewish experience of Nazi state violence wasn't just absent in the immediate post-war years. You know, I've talked about this today as being very centered on resistance survivors, the resistance and the deportation linked in people's minds. But that doesn't mean that, that no one ever said anything about Jewish suffering. The way that I like to think about it is that Jewish suffering in the camps and the awareness of kind of the qualitative difference of the extermination facilities from the concentration camps was there all along as a kind of haunting presence. So Jewish survivors, they're not allowed to join the CICRC, but they hover around its work throughout its existence, taking on various roles. The group's lawyer is a survivor of Drancy, the detention camp outside of Paris. The group's secretary is Leon Poliakov, who is one of the foremost historians of the Holocaust of his generation or any generation. So it's a little bit more complicated than just saying, you know, a switch flipped. There's a movement from margin to center, I think, instead of that. And that's the best I can do.
Well, Emma, we appreciate it. I want to thank you so much for this very interesting, illuminating conversation about French concentration camp survivors. You've given us a lot to think about. I want to urge our audience to read Emma's book, Political Survivors, The Resistance, the Cold War, and the Fight Against Concentration Camps After 1945. And I would like to thank all our viewers for joining us this morning and to tune in to future webinars here at the National World War II Museum. Thanks to everybody.
Thank you so much.